You think you know Little Red Riding Hood? A sweet girl in a crimson cloak, skipping through the forest with a basket of goodies for her sick grandmother. A hungry wolf who tricks his way into the cottage. And if you grew up on Disney or the Brothers Grimm, you probably remember the heroic huntsman who cuts them both free from the wolf's belly, ending the story with a neat moral about staying on the path and listening to your mother. But that version, the one you were told as a child, is a lie. Not a misspelling or a simplification, but a deliberate erasure of what this story was actually meant to teach. Because before it became a bedtime tale for children, Little Red Riding Hood was a grim survival guide for peasant girls in pre-industrial France. A world where the monsters weren't animals at all. They were men. Charming men. Polite men. Men who used sweet words and gentle smiles to lure young women into situations from which there was no rescue and no redemption. The original versions featured no huntsman, no happy ending, and no moral about obedience. Instead, they taught girls how to recognize human predators, how to survive sexual violence, and how to escape through cunning when no one was coming to save them. Over centuries, this brutal education was systematically dismantled, first by the French aristocracy, who weaponized the tale to control social mobility, then by German romantics, who transformed it into a lesson in patriarchal domesticity. What began as a warning about the dangers girls actually faced became a story that taught them to wait passively for male rescue. Once you understand what the Red Hood really meant in 17th century France, once you learn why the original girl had to eat her own grandmother's flesh, you'll realize this was never just a fairy tale. It was testimony. And today, we're uncovering what centuries of sanitization tried to bury. The story we call Little Red Riding Hood didn't emerge from the imagination of a single author. Its roots stretch back thousands of years, appearing in fragments across cultures that had no contact with one another, from classical Greece to medieval France to East Asia. This suggests something profound. The core terror at the heart of the tale addresses a universal human fear that transcends geography and time. In ancient Greece, the historian Pausanias recorded a local legend about a malevolent spirit who dressed himself in wolf skin and demanded the annual sacrifice of a virgin for the explicit purpose of rape. This wasn't a story about animal hunger. It was about male violence disguised as something else. A predator who wore a costume to infiltrate the domestic space. The pattern was already established. The threat comes from something that looks like it belongs, but doesn't. Something that wears the skin of the familiar to get close enough to strike. The Roman poet Horace made reference to Lamia, an ogress with cannibalistic appetites, who swallowed children whole. In one version of her myth, a hero cuts open her belly to rescue a child still alive inside. Sound familiar? The motif of rescue through disembowelment, of survival inside the predator's body, appears across ancient Mediterranean folklore, suggesting that the swallowing and cutting open in Little Red Riding Hood has roots far older than medieval France. In Norse mythology, the structural parallels appear in the Thrymskvida, where Thor disguises himself as a bride to infiltrate the giant's halls. When the giants notice Thor's unnaturally fierce eyes and voracious appetite, they question whether this bride is truly what she appears to be. This rhythmic interrogation, those big eyes, that strange behavior, mirrors the famous dialogue between Little Red and the wolf. What big eyes you have, what big teeth you have. The better to see you with, the better to eat you with. It's not just a children's rhyme. It's an ancient teaching device for recognizing when something is wrong with a trusted figure. Beyond Europe, the pattern repeats. In East Asian folklore, tales like Grand Aunt Tiger from China and similar stories from Korea and Japan feature a predator who murders a grandmother and then impersonates her to deceive the grandchildren. In North African tradition, specifically among the Kabyle people, versions exist where a girl visits her grandfather and is recognized by the distinctive sound her bracelets make, emphasizing that identity must be verified through multiple senses because appearance alone can be faked. What all these variants share is a specific pedagogical function. teaching children to distinguish between right caregivers and dangerous infiltrators, particularly when the threat originates from inside the domestic sphere. The wolf at the door is frightening. The wolf already inside the house, wearing your grandmother's nightgown, speaking with her voice. That's the nightmare that crosses all cultural boundaries. Because the most dangerous predator isn't the obvious monster. It's the one who knows how to look like someone you're supposed to trust. One of the earliest written versions of the tale appears in a Latin manuscript dated to the year 1022, produced by Egbert of Liège, a cathedral schoolmaster. This version features a young girl in a red cloak who is taken by a wolf, but here's where it diverges radically from everything that came after. In Egbert's poem, the wolf's cubs attempt to devour the girl but cannot because of the sanctity of her red garment. The cloak itself protects her. It has power. This detail is crucial because it reveals what the red hood originally meant before it was reinterpreted through the lens of sin and sexual availability. In early medieval Christianity, red was the color of baptism, of being marked as belonging to the faith. The red cloak signified divine protection, a visible sign that this child was part of the Christian community, and therefore under God's, and by extension the Church's, watch and care. For a peasant child in the 11th century, that red garment would have been extraordinarily expensive, likely gifted by a wealthy patron or the church itself for a baptismal ceremony. It marked the wearer as special, protected, and valuable. The wolf's inability to consume her wasn't about magic in the fairy tale sense. It was about social reality. A child marked as belonging to the church or a powerful household had a form of immunity that orphans and unmarked children did not. To harm her was to invite retribution from institutions with actual power. But notice what happens over the next 600 years. The protective function of the red cloak gradually inverts. By the time Charles Perrault writes his version in 1697, the red hood no longer protects the girl, it marks her as a target. The color red shifts from signifying divine protection to signifying sin, blood, sexual maturity, and transgression. The same garment that once meant this child is protected by God comes to mean this girl is asking for trouble. This inversion wasn't accidental. It reflects a fundamental shift in how European society understood female vulnerability. In the medieval church's framework, innocence deserved protection and those who violated it deserved punishment. But in the emerging bourgeois morality of 17th century France, female vulnerability became something suspicious. If something bad happened to a young woman, perhaps she had invited it. Perhaps her clothing was too fine, her behavior too bold, her presence in the wrong place at the wrong time a sign of moral failure rather than simple misfortune. The red hood transforms from a shield into a target, from a symbol of community protection into evidence of individual guilt. And that transformation tells us everything about what was happening to the story itself. Before Charles Perrault ever touched this tale, it circulated for centuries among European peasants as an oral tradition known in France as the story of grandmother. This version bore almost no resemblance to the sanitized fairy tale we know today. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't moral. It was a survival guide for a world where wolves were a real threat and human predators were even worse. In the peasant version, the antagonist isn't called a wolf. He's called the bzu, the werewolf. And this distinction is critical because a werewolf is fundamentally different from an animal. A wolf kills because it's hungry. A werewolf kills because it has chosen to abandon its humanity, to indulge in perverted desires while retaining human intelligence and speech. The bzu can talk, charm, and deceive. He doesn't just want to eat the girl. He wants to play twisted games with her first. The story begins with the girl being sent to visit her grandmother, but unlike in later versions, she's given a choice. Will you take the path of needles or the path of pins? This detail baffled literary scholars for centuries until ethnographers studying rural French communities uncovered its meaning. In pre-industrial villages, young girls marked their transition to womanhood by spending a winter season apprenticed to a seamstress, learning to sew. The path of needles represented this long, arduous process of acquiring a trade and becoming an adult woman. It was difficult, time-consuming work that required patience and skill. The path of pins, by contrast, represented childhood and quick, unskilled repairs, the hasty work children do when they tear their clothes. By choosing the path of needles, the girl in the oral tradition signals her readiness for maturation, even if it means entering dangerous territory. She's choosing to grow up, and that choice makes her vulnerable. While the girl takes the slow, responsible path, the bazoo takes the shortcut, the path of pins. He arrives at the grandmother's cottage first. And what happens next is where the oral tradition reveals its true brutality. The bazoo kills the grandmother. But he doesn't just kill her, he butchers her. He stores her flesh in the pantry and her blood in a wine bottle, then he puts on her nightgown and gets into her bed. When the girl arrives, the bazoo, wearing her grandmother's voice, invites her to eat and drink. There's meat in the pantry, he says. There's wine in the bottle. The girl, hungry from her journey, prepares herself a meal, and she eats her grandmother's flesh. She drinks her grandmother's blood. A cat witnessing this horror calls out, "Slut! You're eating your own grandmother's meat and drinking her blood." This moment of forced cannibalism is the emotional center of the oral tradition, and it's also the element that later authors would most desperately want to erase. But its presence in the peasant version wasn't random cruelty. It was symbolic instruction. By consuming her grandmother, the girl swallows the previous generation. She becomes the new woman of the family through a traumatic, violating ritual. She's not just losing her grandmother. She's being forced to take her place through the most grotesque means imaginable, by literally incorporating her elder's body into her own. After the cannibalistic meal, the bazoo tells the girl to come to bed. And here the oral tradition becomes explicit about what this story is actually teaching. The girl begins to undress. She removes her apron. "Throw it in the fire," says the bazoo. "You won't need it anymore." She removes her bodice. "Throw it in the fire." Her skirt. "Throw it in the fire." Her stockings. "Throw it in the fire." Each piece of clothing burns, and with it burns a layer of her social identity, her protection, her connection to her mother and her village. The fire consumes the markers of her innocence and her childhood. She is being systematically stripped of everything that marked her as a daughter, as someone under the protection of a family and community. When she's finally naked, she has nothing left but her body and her wits. She gets into bed with the bazoo, and then comes the famous dialogue, which in the oral tradition is far more sinister than the children's rhyme suggests. "Grandmother, what big arms you have. The better to hold you with, my dear. What big legs you have. The better to run with. What big ears you have. The better to hear with. What big eyes you have. The better to see you with. What big teeth you have. The better to eat you with." This isn't a naive child slowly realizing something's wrong. This is a young woman stalling for time, cataloging the physical characteristics of her attacker while her mind races to find an escape. She knows exactly what's about to happen to her, and she knows no one is coming to save her. But here's where the oral tradition diverges completely from every literary version that would follow. The girl doesn't scream. She doesn't faint. She doesn't wait for rescue. She uses her intelligence. She tells the bazoo she needs to go outside to relieve herself. The bazoo, suspicious, ties a rope around her ankle so she can't run. She goes outside and immediately unties the rope from her ankle and ties it to a plum tree in the yard. Then she runs. The bazoo waits. Eventually, he pulls on the rope and realizes it's tied to something that isn't moving. By the time he gets outside, she's gone. She's escaped. Through quick thinking, through deception, through her own agency, she saves herself. There is no huntsman. There is no father. There is no male intervention of any kind. The girl survives because she's clever enough to manipulate her attacker and brave enough to run when the moment comes. This ending, this demonstration of female resourcefulness and agency in the face of male violence, is precisely what later versions of the story would systematically erase. Because teaching girls to save themselves was apparently more dangerous than teaching them to be eaten by wolves. In 1697, Charles Perrault published his version of the tale in a collection called Stories or Tales from Times Past with Morals. And with it, he fundamentally transformed what Little Red Riding Hood meant and who it was meant to serve. Perrault was writing for the French aristocracy and the court of King Louis XIV. His audience wasn't peasant girls who needed to know how to escape predators. His audience was wealthy women and their daughters who needed to understand the intricate social rules of the Ancien Régime. And Perrault used this old peasant survival guide to reinforce those rules through terror. The most significant change Perrault made was the introduction of the specific detail of the Red Riding Hood, the chaperon rouge. In 17th century France, a chaperon was a hood with a long tail that hung down the back, and it was distinctly an upper-class garment. For a peasant girl to wear such a hood was an act of what scholars now call transgressive social mobility. Dressing above your station, performing a class identity that didn't belong to you, but Perrault went further. He specified that the hood was red, and not just any red. Red dye in the 17th century was phenomenally expensive. The most vibrant reds came from cochineal insects imported from the Americas at enormous cost. Red was the color of royalty, specifically associated with Louis XIV himself, whose famous red-heeled shoes were a mark of his absolute power. For a peasant girl to wear this color wasn't just presumptuous, it was a symbolic invasion of royal space. By dressing his Little Red Riding Hood in aristocratic fashion in royal colors, Perrault created a character who was fundamentally transgressive. She wasn't staying in her proper place. She was attempting to look like someone she wasn't, to claim a social status that didn't belong to her. And Perrault's message was clear. This transgression would be punished. The wolf doesn't just kill her. He consumes her entirely, erasing her from existence. This is what happens, Perrault warns his readers, when the lower classes try to dress like the elite. Perrault eliminated every element of the oral tradition that showed female agency. There's no choice between needles and pins. There's no cannibalism. There's no rope trick. There's no escape. Both the grandmother and the girl are eaten, and they stay eaten. The story ends with their deaths. Perrault then adds something the oral tradition never had, a moral poem addressed to well-bred young ladies, warning them about gentle wolves. These gentle wolves, Perrault explains, aren't the obviously dangerous kind. They're the ones who are sweet-tongued, obliging, and polite. They follow young women through the streets and into their very bedrooms. And these wolves, Perrault warns, are the most dangerous of all. In the slang of the French court, elle avoir vu le loup, she has seen the wolf, was a direct euphemism for the loss of virginity. Perrault's wolf isn't a beast. He's a libertine, a seducer, a man who ruins a woman's reputation. And in 17th century France, there was no recovery from that ruin. A woman who saw the wolf was socially dead. When Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm published their version of the tale in 1812 as part of their collection of German folk stories, they created what would become the most influential version of Little Red Riding Hood in history. But the Grimms weren't simply recording folklore. They were German nationalists and romantic scholars who believed fairy tales should teach proper German values. Values that centered on obedience to authority, respect for parental wisdom, and the sanctity of the nuclear family. The Grimms' most significant addition was the huntsman, a masculine authority figure who arrives at the last possible moment to save the girl and her grandmother from the wolf's belly. This character didn't exist in any prior version. He was invented to fulfill a specific ideological function, to demonstrate that women and children, when they disobey or make mistakes, must wait for patriarchal authority to rescue them. They cannot save themselves. They shouldn't even try. The huntsman represents not just an individual man, but the protective power of the state and the father. In the Grimm's version, after the huntsman cuts open the wolf and rescues its victims, they fill the wolf's belly with stones, and when he wakes and tries to run away, the weight kills him. This is justice administered by male authority, and it replaces the girl's agency entirely. Where the oral tradition taught girls to escape through cleverness, the Grimms teach them to wait, to be passive, to trust that rescue will come if they're patient enough and virtuous enough to deserve it. The Grimms also introduce the concept of the path. In their version, the mother explicitly warns Little Red Cap not to stray from the path when she travels through the forest. This path is both literal and metaphorical. Literally, it's the safe route through the woods. Metaphorically, it represents the narrow social expectations placed on young women. Don't deviate, don't explore, don't question, don't seek adventure. Stay where you're told to stay, do what you're told to do, and you'll be safe. When the wolf encounters Little Red Cap in the forest, he suggests she look around at all the beautiful flowers, that she enjoy her walk instead of hurrying along grimly. In the oral tradition, this would have been recognized as the predator's attempt to distract and isolate his victim. But in the Grimm's version, it's transformed into a temptation to disobey, to stray from the path of duty. When the girl accepts the wolf's suggestion and stops to pick flowers, she's not being trapped by a predator. She's failing a moral test. Her punishment is to be eaten. Her rescue comes only after she's experienced the consequences of disobedience. And her rebirth from the wolf's belly is presented as a second chance, an opportunity to learn her lesson and stay on the path from now on. The Grimms transformed a story about predatory violence into a story about female obedience and the dangers of curiosity. But there's another layer to the Grimm's project that's worth examining. They were collecting these tales during a period of intense German nationalism, when intellectuals were attempting to construct a unified German cultural identity out of the fragmented principalities and kingdoms that would eventually become modern Germany. Fairy tales were seen as repositories, authentic German folk wisdom, the pure voice of the folk unspoiled by foreign influence or elite corruption. The irony is that in their effort to preserve authentic folk wisdom, the Grimms systematically sanitized and moralized stories that had been far more pragmatic and brutal in their oral forms. They removed sexual content, added Christian moral frameworks, and emphasized obedience to authority, all in service of creating a particular vision of German culture that would be respectable to middle-class families. The peasant women who had originally transmitted these tales would likely have found the Grimm's versions unrecognizable and useless. The enduring power of Little Red Riding Hood lies not just in its surface narrative, but in its ability to function as a mirror for the darkest aspects of human psychological development. Throughout the 20th century, psychoanalysts and depth psychologists became obsessed with this tale, recognizing in it a symbolic map of the internal conflicts that accompany sexual maturation and the integration of the shadow self. Bruno Bettelheim, in his influential work, The Uses of Enchantment, argued that the story represents what he called the nymphet stage, a period when a girl experiences premature budding sexuality that conflicts with her childish self-image. According to Bettelheim, the girl faces a battle between her animal nature, represented by the wolf, and her conscience, represented by the mother's warnings. This is the conflict between the id and the superego, between the pleasure principle that wants immediate gratification and the reality principle that demands delayed satisfaction and adherence to social rules. Erich Fromm and other psychoanalysts saw in the Red Hood a symbol of menstrual blood, the physical marker of sexual maturity. The mother's warning not to break the wine bottle becomes, in this reading, a metaphor for preserving virginity. Don't break your maidenhead. The girl's disobedience isn't just about picking flowers. It's about acknowledging her emerging sexuality, about wanting to explore the world and her own body in ways that her mother has forbidden. The wolf, then, isn't just an external threat. He's the personification of the girl's own desires, the dark impulses she's been taught to repress. When she gets into bed with him, when she participates in the ritualized dialogue about his big eyes and big teeth, she's confronting aspects of her own nature that terrify her. The wolf's consumption of the grandmother takes on an even darker meaning in this framework. Bettelheim suggests it represents the girl's unconscious wish to eliminate the mother figure so she can have the father figure to herself. From a Jungian perspective, the forest represents the unconscious mind, a liminal space where the orderly structures of consciousness give way to chaos and primal forces. The wolf is the girl's shadow, the repository of all the aspects of herself that she's been taught to deny or reject. To enter the forest is to begin the process of individuation, of integrating the shadow into conscious awareness. The act of being swallowed by the wolf and then cut free represents death and rebirth, the necessary destruction of the child self so the adult self can emerge. But there's something deeply troubling about these psychological readings, and feminist scholars haven't been shy about pointing it out. The psychoanalytic framework, by focusing on the girl's internal conflicts and unconscious desires, effectively excuses the predator. If the wolf is just a projection of the girl's own repressed sexuality, then he's not really dangerous. The real problem is the girl's failure to properly repress her desires, to stay on the path, to resist temptation. This is victim blaming dressed up in psychological terminology. The psychoanalytic approach also ignores the historical context that gave birth to the story. When peasant women told this tale to their daughters, they weren't trying to help them integrate their shadows or resolve Oedipal conflicts. They were trying to keep them alive in a world where sexual violence against young women was common and unpunished. The psychological readings, for all their sophistication, miss the story's pragmatic core. This is about survival, not symbolism. The terror of the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood wasn't purely metaphorical for the story's original audiences. In pre-industrial France, wolves were an actual daily threat to rural communities, particularly to children and women traveling alone. Between 1764 and 1767, a series of attacks in the Gévaudan region of south-central France killed over 100 people, most of them women and children, and wounded many more. The attacks were so savage and the creature so elusive that it sparked a national panic and became known as the Beast of Gévaudan. Eyewitness descriptions of the beast were contradictory and strange. Some described it as an enormous wolf, larger than any natural wolf had a right to be. Others claimed it moved with an intelligence and strategy that seemed almost human. It targeted the head and neck of its victims with surgical precision, suggesting not just hunger, but intentionality. Royal hunters, local nobility, and eventually the king's own lieutenants were deployed to kill the creature, but it evaded them for 3 years. The Beast of Gévaudan became a symbol of everything that lurked at the edges of civilization, the wild spaces that humans couldn't fully control, the violence that erupted when the boundary between the domestic and the savage broke down. And it reinforced the belief that the forest was a place of genuine danger, where monsters that looked like animals but behaved with human cunning waited for the vulnerable to wander off the path. But alongside the fear of actual wolves, there existed an even deeper terror, the fear of the werewolf. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Western Europe experienced what historians now call the werewolf hunting craze, a period when communities became convinced that certain individuals among them had made pacts with demons to transform into wolves. These weren't cases of people believing they saw literal shapeshifters. These were accusations against members of the community, neighbors, relatives, outcasts, who were suspected of cannibalism, murder, and sexual violence. The werewolf represented the ultimate violation of social trust. A wolf is an external enemy, clearly marked as other. But a werewolf is an internal enemy, someone who sits at your table during the day and hunts children at night. The Bzu of the oral tradition carries this specific terror. He's not an animal. He's a human who has chosen to abandon his humanity. to indulge in appetites so perverted that he's become monstrous. And because he retains human intelligence and speech, he's far more dangerous than any natural predator. In one documented case from 1598, a tailor named Jacques Roulet was found in a forest near a mutilated corpse, his hands covered in blood and his body scratched as if from a fight. Under interrogation, Roulet confessed to being a werewolf who hunted with two companions in wolf form, killing and devouring children and adults. He claimed that a salve given to him by his parents allowed him to transform. The court, after hearing testimony about his mental state and poverty, commuted his death sentence to confinement in a monastery. These werewolf trials reveal the social anxieties embedded in Little Red Riding Hood. The story warns girls not just about strange men in the woods, but about the men they already know. The ones who look normal and trustworthy but harbor predatory desires. The monster doesn't announce itself. It wears a familiar face. It speaks in a voice you recognize. And by the time you realize what it really is, you're already in its bed. The historical reality of wolf attacks in France also shaped how communities understood danger and vulnerability. Wolves typically attacked during winter months when food was scarce, and they primarily targeted individuals who were isolated from the group, shepherds watching flocks alone, children sent on errands through the forest, elderly people living on the outskirts of villages. The lesson was clear. Safety lay in community, in staying together, in avoiding isolation. To be alone was to be vulnerable. This understanding fed into the story's warning about straying from the path. The path wasn't just a physical route through dangerous terrain. It was the visible, communal route where other travelers might pass, where you might call for help, where your absence might be noticed quickly. To leave the path was to isolate yourself, to become invisible to your community, to put yourself in a position where violence could occur without witnesses or consequences. When we trace the evolution of Little Red Riding Hood from oral tradition through Perrault to the Grimms to Disney, we witness what scholars call the severance of female knowledge, the systematic erasure of women's wisdom about survival, sexuality, and self-preservation. The oral tradition, passed down primarily by women to girls, contained practical knowledge encoded in symbolic form. The literary tradition, controlled primarily by men writing for mixed or elite audiences, replaced that knowledge with moral lessons about obedience and punishment. In the oral tradition, the girl is part of a community of women. Her mother sends her to her grandmother, maintaining the bond between generations. The path of needles connects her to other young women learning the seamstress trade, a communal female space where knowledge about bodies, sex, birth, and danger was transmitted. Even the grandmother, though she's killed, represents the repository or tree of female experience that should have protected the girl, but failed. The tragedy isn't that the girl was naive. The tragedy is that the knowledge women had accumulated about male violence wasn't enough to save them. When Perrault removed the path of needles, the cannibalism, and the rope trick, he severed the girl from this community of female knowledge. She becomes isolated, cut off from the practical wisdom that might have saved her. And when the Grimms introduced the huntsman and the mother's warning about the path, they completed the transformation. Now the girl's only source of wisdom is parental authority, specifically paternal authority embodied in the huntsman. She doesn't need the accumulated knowledge of other women. She needs to obey the rules men set for her. The rope trick, the moment of clever escape, was the heart of the oral tradition's pedagogical function. It taught girls that when they found themselves in a situation where male violence was inevitable, they should use deception and quick thinking to create an opportunity for flight. It validated the idea that a girl's intelligence and courage were her primary survival tools, that she shouldn't freeze or faint or wait for rescue, but should act decisively in her own defense. By removing this element, later versions of the story taught girls the opposite lesson. When confronted with male violence, become passive, wait for authority, accept that your own actions are useless or counterproductive. The Grimms even added a second ending where Little Red Cap encounters another wolf and, having learned her lesson, immediately runs to her grandmother's house to warn her so they can trap the wolf together. But notably, they don't defeat the wolf through their own efforts. They prepare the trap and then wait for the wolf to fall into it, demonstrating their learning by waiting properly rather than by fighting actively. This transformation reflects broader changes in European society's understanding of gender roles. In peasant communities where survival required everyone's labor and intelligence, women were expected to be competent, resourceful, and capable of defending themselves when necessary. But as industrialization created new class structures and separate spheres for men and women, the ideal woman became fragile, innocent, and dependent on male protection. A woman who could outwit a predator through violence or deception wasn't ideal. She was threatening. She suggested that women didn't need men, that they could survive on their own terms. The seamstress community, represented by the Path of Needles, was particularly significant. These were spaces where young women learned not just a trade, but a whole body of knowledge about female experience. Older women taught younger ones about menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and the management of male attention and violence. They shared stories about which men in the community were dangerous, which routes through the village were safe, which excuses could be used to escape unwanted situations. This was practical, life-saving knowledge transmitted orally in female-only spaces. When the literary versions removed references to this community, they didn't just simplify the story. They erased evidence that such communities existed and had value. They suggested that women gathered in groups had nothing important to teach each other, that the only knowledge worth having came from authority figures, parents, teachers, clergy, all of whom in the literary versions are implicitly male or speak with male-authorized voices. The most haunting insight of Little Red Riding Hood, the revelation that makes the tale still relevant centuries after its origins, is contained in Perrault's moral about the gentle wolves. These are not the obviously dangerous men, not the strangers who look like threats. These are the charming ones, the polite ones, the ones who follow young women into their homes with sweet words and patient smiles. These wolves are the most dangerous of all, Perrault warns, because by the time you realize what they are, it's already too late. Modern retellings of the story have grasped this truth more firmly than the sanitized children's versions ever did. In the 1996 film Freeway, the wolf is Bob Wolverton, a child psychologist and serial killer who picks up teenage girls and earns their trust before murdering them. He's educated, well-dressed, drives a nice car, and presents himself as a concerned helper to troubled youth. He's the perfect embodiment of Perrault. Gentle wolf, someone whose professional and social credentials make him seem safe, someone whose predatory nature is hidden behind layers of respectability. The story's psychological power lies in its recognition that predators don't announce themselves. They don't wear signs. They integrate themselves into communities, families, institutions. They gain access to victims through trust, through authority, through the social structures that are supposed to protect the vulnerable. The original peasant women who told this story knew that the greatest danger young girls faced came from men they knew, relatives, neighbors, employers, men with power over them who could hurt them behind closed doors and never face consequences. The red hood, which began as a symbol of protection, became a symbol of vulnerability and has now in contemporary culture become a symbol of knowing agency. Modern advertising and film often portray Little Red Riding Hood as sexy, sophisticated, and in control, someone who uses the wolf's attraction to her as a weapon against him. But this transformation, while superficially empowering, misses the point entirely. It suggests that women can protect themselves through sexual sophistication, through out-seducing their seducers. It places the responsibility for avoiding male violence on women's shoulders rather than addressing the predators themselves. The dark revelation at the core of Little Red Riding Hood isn't about sex or maturity or disobedience. It's about power. The story documents a world where young women had no institutional protections, where they could be violated with impunity, where their own communities would question what they did to invite attack rather than punishing their attackers. The oral tradition tried to give girls practical tools for survival in that world. The literary tradition took those tools away and replaced them with moral lessons about feminine virtue and the importance of male authority. We've sanitized this tale so thoroughly that most people encountering it today have no idea they're reading a survival guide for a world where girls could be hunted, consumed, and erased, and where the systems of power would blame them for their own destruction. We've turned it into a story about a silly girl who didn't listen to her mother and needed a strong man to save her. We've made it cute. But the original storytellers knew something we've forgotten. They knew that the wolf doesn't live in the forest. He lives in the village. He sits at your table. He might be wearing your grandmother's face. And when you're alone with him in that cottage in the woods, with your clothing burning in the fireplace and his teeth showing in the firelight, no one is coming to save you. The only person who can save you is yourself. That's what Little Red Riding Hood was supposed to teach. And that's exactly the lesson we decided girls didn't need to learn. The transformation of this tale from survival guide to moral lesson to children's entertainment represents a deliberate cultural amnesia. Each generation that softened the story, that removed another element of female agency or added another layer of male rescue, was participating in a project of forgetting. Forgetting that women once taught their daughters how to recognize predators. Forgetting that girls were once expected to save themselves. Forgetting that the greatest dangers come not from the forest, but from the men who have access to our homes, our trust, our vulnerability. And perhaps most disturbing is what this forgetting enabled. By teaching girls that the solution to male violence is obedience to male authority, by replacing the rope trick with the huntsman's axe, the story became complicit in the very system it once warned against. It taught girls to distrust their own judgment, to wait for rescue rather than fight for escape, to see themselves as passive victims whose only hope lies in male protection. It transformed a tool of resistance into a tool of control. When we tell Little Red Riding Hood to children today, we're not sharing a fairy tale. We're transmitting a century-old lesson in feminine helplessness, wrapped in such pretty packaging that we don't even recognize it for what it is. The girl in the red hood has become a symbol of innocence destroyed, of curiosity punished, of disobedience meeting its inevitable consequence. She's not a survivor. She's a cautionary tale. And that's exactly what the men who rewrote her story wanted her to be.